Let's talk about Chapter 8 of Book 1 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. This is pages 13 through 15 of the crisp Cambridge translation of the Ethics. This is just about 2 pages of text, but it contains at least 4 important passages that I want to direct your attention to. First, the second paragraph of this translation reads, "Goods have been classified into 3 groups, those called external goods, goods of the soul, and goods of the body. Goods of the soul are the ones we call most strictly and most especially good, and the actions and activities of the soul we may attribute to the soul. Our conception of happiness, then, is plausible insofar as it accords with this view, a venerable one that has been accepted by philosophers." My comment on this passage is simply note the division of goods that Aristotle says has been generally accepted at his time. There are 3 types of goods, or ends, that we pursue: external goods, goods of the soul or of the mind, and goods of the body. And of these 3, it's the goods of the soul that are most strictly and most especially good. And so our preliminary definition of happiness as this activity of the rational part of the soul is going to fit with this largely accepted view. In the next sections of this chapter, Aristotle goes on to try to show how his preliminary account of happiness harmonizes with some common views about happiness. The next really important part of this chapter comes at the bottom of page 13, where Aristotle draws a distinction between the possession of virtue and the activity of virtue. Here's what he writes. "Our account of happiness is in harmony with those who say that happiness is virtue, or some particular virtue, since activity in accordance with virtue is characteristic of virtue. Presumably, though, it makes a great difference whether we conceive of the chief good as consisting in possession or in use, that is to say, in a state or in an activity. For while a state can exist without producing any good consequences, as it does in the case of a person sleeping or lying idle for some other reason, this is impossible for an activity. It will necessarily engage in action, and do so well. As in the Olympic Games, it is not the most attractive and the strongest who are crowned, but those who compete, since it is from this group that the winners come. So in life, it is those who act rightly who will attain what is noble and good." Notice how in this passage Aristotle goes beyond simply identifying happiness or flourishing with virtue. He notes that we can have virtue in 2 ways. We can have virtue as a simple possession, as a characteristic of ourselves, but virtue as a mere quality or possession is not sufficient for happiness, because it is possible to have this type of virtue without actually producing any good effects. So he notes a person who is sleeping or who is lying idle, who is in a coma or unconscious. We might say that he possesses courage, that he possesses honesty, but he's not putting it to use. And he makes an analogy then to the Olympic Games, one that we'll recognize from sports. It's not the strongest or the fastest person who gets the victory, it's the strongest or fastest person who proves themselves in competition. The person who has the virtue, who has the speed, but never competes, does not win the praise or the award that goes to the victor. That's reserved for the fastest person in the competition. So he says we should be thinking of virtue and happiness as a type of activity that we do, something that we engage in the world, not something that we simply possess as a static quality of our soul. In the next paragraph, Aristotle tells us something important about the relationship between the life of virtue and pleasure. He notes that virtuous people take pleasure in virtuous behavior. Here's part of what he writes. "It is also the case that the life of these people, that is, virtuous people, is pleasurable in itself. For experiencing pleasure is an aspect of the soul, and each person finds pleasure in that of which he is said to be fond, as a horse lover finds pleasure in a horse, and someone who likes wonderful sights finds it in a wonderful sight. In the same way, a lover of justice finds it in the sphere of justice, and in general a person with virtue finds pleasure in what accords with virtue. The pleasures of the masses, because they are not pleasant by nature, conflict with one another, but the pleasures of those who are fond of noble things are pleasant by nature. Actions in accordance with virtue are like this, so that they are pleasant to these people as well as in themselves. Their life, therefore, has no need of pleasure as some kind of lucky ornament, but contains its pleasure in itself, because in addition to what we have already said, the person who does not enjoy noble actions is not good. For no one would call a person just if he did not enjoy acting justly, or generous if he did not enjoy generous actions, and the same goes for the other virtues. If this is so, it follows that actions in accordance with virtue are pleasant in themselves. For my comment, note here that Aristotle is telling us a few things about the happy and virtuous person. The virtuous person is someone who takes pleasure in their activity of virtue. So it's a person who does virtuous and good things, not grudgingly or fitfully or painfully or with tremendous effort, but a person who finds these things to be pleasant and rewarding in themselves. And he gives the example of justice, a person who is just but finds difficulty or has pain in actually being just. This person has not yet fully achieved the perfection of the virtue of justice. The perfection of that virtue should include a kind of joy or pleasure that's taken in the performance of it. In the same way, an honest person who has to force himself to tell the truth, who experiences great psychic distress, but still comes through and tells the truth in the end, this person has not yet achieved the perfect virtue of honesty. Or, to bring in a different virtue that he doesn't mention, the virtue of chastity, which is sexual self-control. The person who is chaste but only fitfully and with great effort and pain hasn't yet perfected this virtue either. So we have the idea that the pleasure that comes with virtuous action is not added into them in addition to the virtuous action. It is inherently part of the activity in the way that the virtuous person does it. To be a virtuous person is precisely to find pleasure in the activity that constitutes your virtue. The final paragraph of this chapter brings up the necessity of external goods for happiness, according to Aristotle. And this is a very important point and an important point of contrast between Aristotle and Socrates and Plato. He writes at the bottom of page 14 and the top of page 15, "Nevertheless, as we suggested, happiness obviously needs the presence of external goods as well, since it is impossible, or at least no easy matter, to perform noble actions without resources. For in many actions we employ, as if they were instruments at our disposal, friends, wealth, and political power. Again, being deprived of some things, such as high birth, noble children, beauty, spoils our blessedness. For the person who is terribly ugly, of low birth, or solitary and childless, is not really the sort to be happy, still less perhaps if he has children or friends who are thoroughly bad or good but dead. As we have said then, there seems to be some additional need for some sort of prosperity like this. For this reason, some identify happiness with good fortune, while others identify it with virtue." So, what is Aristotle telling us in this final paragraph? He's saying that happiness, or flourishing, or human excellence, obviously needs the presence of external goods as well. His reason for this: it is impossible, or very difficult, to perform noble or good actions without resources. So this type of good, this external good, which is not a good of the soul or of the body, but a good of material prosperity, Aristotle says is required to some degree for the performance of these noble actions. If one is going to be generous, one needs friends to be the beneficiaries of one's generosity. If I'm going to be honest, I have to live in a social context in which I can engage in speech, in which I can practice honesty. So if I were isolated on a desert island, these virtues would no longer be possible for me. I would lack the external goods that are necessary for their practice. Aristotle says in many actions we employ as instruments friends, wealth, and political power. So he's suggesting that there are some goods, some good activities that are only available to people who have these things. People who lack these things are not capable of performing the kind of virtuous actions in which human excellence and human happiness consist. And he says again, being deprived of some things, such as high birth, noble children, or beauty, will spoil our blessedness. We will not be as excellent or as happy as we could have been if we had had these things. Whether we agree or disagree with Aristotle's specific list of external goods that are necessary for human excellence, we can approach separately his question of whether any external goods are necessary for happiness. Is it really necessary for us to have a certain minimal level of external goods, of friends, wealth, political power, in order to perform the activities in which human excellence and human goodness consist? Or are we more inclined to agree with a view like Socrates that the virtue of a good man is the sole requirement for his being happy and excellent? We'll turn to this question later. That brings us to the end of chapter 8 of book 1 of the Ethics. That's all for now. Goodbye.